This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to glean and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, yeah?
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 79. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid. I guess we did another introduction to the episode, like in the middle. Well, yeah, okay. I guess we lost, due to Audacity sucking, we lost like 2 episodes, or not 2 whole episodes, but half of like 2 episodes. Really like half of this one and a third of another. So
yes,
that's why there's been like a huge increase in audio quality between the 2 parts of the episode. Hopefully, because we did buy new microphones, so hopefully you're noticing that we didn't like just get replaced by like better sounding or like crisper sounding gin in the middle.
We are not
the
MIBs
episode.
that
We're
have
not
replaced
MIBs.
the real Dimitri and Khalid.
It's like kind of feels like a little bit like pretentious to have this microphone, but whatever,
Anyways.
Hopefully it'll sound better. Probably won't like end the complaints about the vocal fry or the filler words, but Dimitri was assuring me that now that we're listening to ourselves like as we speak, which is a little odd, but we were saying that maybe that'll make me notice when I'm saying but
it's possible.
I just did it, so
according to the podcast god himself, Joe Rogan.
We took the production advice of Joe Rogan. Yeah, so he knows what's up.
That's the extent to which we've sold out. We've taken some mild podcasting advice.
He's got his Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours of podcasting, so he would know, right?
True, and we're on our way.
He's the expert.
We're on our way fast,
True, yeah, we are on our way fast in terms of sheer hour output.
Yes,
if not
exactly.
like lunch episodes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before...
How many hours of Subliminal Jihad do you think that there are? Well, this is episode 79. We're re-recording this hour. So.
Yes,
but
most
anyway,
are at least
Let's get
3
back
hours
into
long,
the episode so
and
that
we're
it doesn't
at 80.
become
But we're approaching
longer
probably
by
200.
virtue of getting to do it over again.
Yeah, we're still talking over each other. That's okay. I think we have about 250 hours, somewhere around there.
I don't think that. I think it's a little optimistic to think we're not going to talk over each other. I feel like we've been talking over each other for 10 years of knowing each other, in real life. It has nothing to do with the audio equipment.
Yes, and it's not rude, contrary to what I guess some people think. It's actually.
Does someone call it rude?
I don't know. I think some people are just turned off by it. They think it's disrespectful to talk over people.
We're friends.
I know.
We interrupt each other. You interrupt me, I interrupt you.
Yeah.
Whatever. I mean, if you ever feel like you haven't had a chance to speak your piece, by all means, do so. And I assume the same goes,
sure. I think we always get our points in, but... Okay,
yeah, I mean, we definitely take... Whatever.
Anyways, so...
Rude. Thank you. Thank you for standing up for us, mutually.
Yeah, well...
From the interruptions.
Well, yeah. Speaking of interruptions, whether it was some kind of demonic, whether it's some kind of demonic djinn or it was some hacker hired by the Silk Toppers to torpedo the information we were trying to get out there.
It was definitely a demonic djinn. Considering the episodes that were interfered with, I feel like it was probably some kind of Silk Topper djinn collaboration. But.
It probably was, yeah. And, I think that makes sense because of the subjects we're to continue covering in this epic volume by Gustavus Myers. And so I think, in the first hour, if I recall correctly, we were mostly talking about the massive land frauds and thefts that basically rampaged throughout the 19th century and led to basically the consolidation of massive tracts of farming land, grazing land, mineral-rich land with oil beneath it, copper, zinc, etc., in the hands of a relatively small class of rapacious robber barons, I guess you could say. But as we move into this volume, Gustavus Myers very deftly, as we've mentioned before, he kind of dances between the dialectic of the class and the individual, of the structural and the personal conspiratorial that we've talked about so much lately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, this is so he does focus on a couple big figures. So the first one, really the centerpiece of this volume, is railroad titan Cornelius Vanderbilt. And, he casts quite a long shadow over the American superclass since kind of the pretty much the Civil War era. And Gustavus does not spare the rod, basically, in describing this man, but also, of course, makes clear that he was simply, at the end of the day, an example of his class, and simply the most rapacious, the despoiler of the despoilers.
Yeah, he makes certain to clarify throughout that he takes pains to repeatedly say, that he shouldn't be singled out as like the worst of the capitalists, because, and in fact, I feel like he's a little bit impatient with the sort of dressing down that Vanderbilt had received from the hypocritical press or from the popular discourse, because he he was sort of held up as someone who was out of control capitalism, or like crony capitalism, or woke capitalism, all these especially egregious forms of capitalism that are really bad, but capitalism itself, on the whole, is what should be indicted, and that's Gustavus Myers' position for sure.
Exactly.
That you can't really indict Vanderbilt too harshly, because these are the lessons that he was taught by the system that he came up in.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think he even says almost exactly that at one point, that we can't hold him to account too harshly because this is the education that he received.
Yep, exactly. So I think without further ado, we can start with Chapter 3, the beginnings of the Vanderbilt fortune. Just give us some grounding into who is this individual, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Where did he come from? Was he descended from a patroon, was he a real, old world, New Netherlands silk topper, or somebody kind of like Astor, who didn't grow up with a lot, but through his sheer rapacity and integration into the older landed gentry was able to, amass an absolutely staggering fortune? Well, let's find out. So I'll just read a little bit from the first few pages of Chapter 3 here. Okay, so the beginnings of the Vanderbilt fortune. The first of the overshadowing fortunes to develop from the ownership and manipulation of railroads was that of Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Havemeyers and other factory owners, whose descendants are now enrolled among the conspicuous multimillionaires, were still in the embryonic stages when Vanderbilt towered aloft in a class by himself with a fortune of $105 million. In these times of enormous individual accumulations and centralization of wealth, the personal possession of $105 million does not excite a fraction of the astonishment, or the astonished comment that it did at Cornelius Vanderbilt's death in 1877. Accustomed as the present generation is to the sight of billionaires or semi-billionaires, it cannot be expected to show any wonderment at fortunes of lesser proportions. Subheader, 90 millions in 15 years. Yet to the people of 30 years ago, around 100 million was something vast and unprecedented. In 1847, millionaires were so infrequent that the very word, as we have seen, was significantly italicized. But here was a man who, figuratively speaking, was 100 millionaires rolled in one. Compared with his wealth, the great fortunes of 10 or 15 years before dwindled into bagatelles. During the Civil War, a fortune of 15 million had been looked upon as monumental. Even the huge Astor fortune, so long far outranking all competitors, lost its exceptional distinction and ceased being the sole unrivaled standard of immense wealth. Nearly a century of fraud was behind the Astor fortune. The greater part of Cornelius Vanderbilt's wealth was massed together in his last 15 years. This was the amazing, unparalleled feature to his generation. Within 15 brief years, he had possessed himself of more than $90 million. His wealth came rushing in at the rate of $6 million a year. Such an accomplishment may not impress the people of these years, familiar as they are with the ease with which John D. Rockefeller and other multimillionaires have long swept in almost fabulous annual revenues. With his yearly income of fully $80 million or $85 million, Rockefeller can look back and smile with superior disdain at the commotion raised by the contemplation of Cornelius Vanderbilt's $6 million. Each period to itself, however, Cornelius Vanderbilt was the golden luminary of his time, a magnate of such combined far-reaching wealth and power as the United States has ever known. Indeed, one overruns the line of tautology in distinguishing between wealth and power. The two were then identical, not less than now. Wealth was the real power. None knew or boasted of this more than old Vanderbilt when, with advancing age, he became more arrogant and choleric, and less inclined to smooth down the storms he provoked by his contemptuous flings at the great pliable public. When threatened by competitors, or occasionally by public officials with the invocation of the law, he habitually sneered at them and vaunted his defiance. In terse sentences interspersed with profanity, he proclaimed the fact that money was law, that it could either buy laws or immunity from the law. Since wealth meant power, both economic and political, it is not difficult to estimate Vanderbilt's supreme place in his day. Far below him in point of possession stretched the 50 million individuals who made up the nation's population. Nearly 10 million were wage laborers, and of the 10 million, fully 500,000 were child laborers. The very best paid of skilled workers received in the highest market not more than $1,040 a year. The usual weekly pay ran from $12 to $20 a week. The average pay of unskilled laborers was $350 a year. More than 7.5 million persons plowed and hoed and harvested the farms of the country. Comparatively few of them could claim a decent living, and a large proportion were in debt. The incomes of the middle class, including individual employers, business and professional men, tradesmen and small middlemen, ranged from $1,000 to $10,000 a year. How immeasurably puny they all seemed besides Vanderbilt. He beheld a multitude of many millions struggling fiercely for the dollar that meant livelihood or fortune, those bits of metal or paper which commanded the necessities, comforts, and luxuries of life, the antidote of grim poverty and the guarantees of good living, which dictated the services, honorable or often dishonorable, of men, women, and children, which bought brains not less than souls, and which put their sordid seal on even the most sacred qualities. Now, by these tokens, he had securely 105 million of these bits of metal or wealth in some form equivalent to them. Millions of people had none of these dollars. The hundreds of thousands had a few. The thousands had hundreds of thousands. The few had millions. He had more than any. Even with all his wealth, great as it was in his day, he would scarcely be worth remembrance were it not that he was a founder of a dynasty of wealth. Therein lies the present importance of his career. From 105 million bequeathed at his death, the Vanderbilt fortune has grown until it now reaches fully 700 million. This is like in 1910.
Yeah, very Dr. Evil.
Right? This is an approximate estimate. The actual amount may be more or less. In 1889, Shearman placed the wealth of Cornelius and William K. Vanderbilt, grandsons of the first Cornelius, at 100 million each, and that of Frederick W. Vanderbilt, a brother of those two men, at 20 million. Adding the fortunes of the various other members of the Vanderbilt family, the Vanderbilts then possessed about 300 million. Since that time, the population and resources of the United States have vastly increased. Wealth in the hold of a few has become more intensely centralized. Great fortunes have gone far beyond their already extraordinary boundaries of 20 years ago. The possessions of the Vanderbilts have expanded and swollen in value everywhere, although recently the Standard Oil oligarchy has been encroaching upon their possessions. Very probable it is that the combined Vanderbilt fortune reaches fully 700 million, actually and potentially. But the incidental mention of such a mass of money conveys no adequate conception of the power of this family. Nominally, it is composed of private citizens with theoretically the same rights and limitations of citizenship held by any other citizen, and no more. But this is a fanciful picture. In reality, the Vanderbilt family is one of the dynasties of inordinately rich families ruling the United States industrially and politically. Singly, it has mastery over many of the railroad and public utility systems and industrial corporations of the United States. In combination with other powerful men or families of wealth, it shares the dictatorship of many more corporations. Under the Vanderbilts' direct domination are 21,000 miles of railroad lines, the ownership of which is embodied in 600 million in stocks and 700 million in bonds. One member alone, William K. Vanderbilt, is a director of 73 transportation and industrial combinations or corporations. And then he goes on to talk about, the instrument, alchemical instrument that makes this all possible, stocks and bonds. So he says bonds that hold present and posterity. And this is where he gets almost a little bit like mystical with it, which I love. We love that about Gustavus. He says, behold, in imagination at least, this mass of stocks and bonds.
Yeah,
heaps
I love
of paper.
this prose.
It's really great.
This is my favorite prose. It's good that we're going back over this because this is definitely my favorite prose so far in this book. Yeah,
this really shows you like the Chautonic magical influence of capital and all its horror.
Yeah.
So, behold, in imagination at least, this mass of stocks and bonds. Heaps of paper they seem, dead, inorganic things. A second's blaze will consume any of them. A few strokes of the fingers tear it into shapeless ribbons. Yet under the institution of law, as it exists, these pieces of paper are endowed with a terrible power of life and death that even enthroned kings do not possess. Those dainty prints with their scrolls and numerals and inscriptions are binding titles to the absolute ownership of a large part of the resources created by the labors of entire peoples. Kingly power is at best shadowy, indefinite, depending mostly upon traditional custom and audacious assumption backed by armed force. If it fall back upon a certain alleged divine right, it cannot produce documents to prove its authority. The industrial monarchs of the United States are fortified with both power and proofs of possession. Those bonds and stocks are the tangible titles to tangible property. Whoso holds them is vested with the ownership of the necessities of tens of millions of subjected people. Great stretches of railroad traverse the country. Here are coal mines to whose products some 90 million people look for warmth. Yonder are factories. There in the cities are streetcar lines and electric light and power supply and gas plants. On every hand are lands and forests and waterways, all owned, you find, by this or that dominant man or family. The mind wanders back in amazement to the times when, if a king conquered territory, he had to erect a fortress or castle and station a garrison to hold it. They that then disputed the king's title could challenge, if they chose, at peril of death, the provisions of that title, which same provisions were swords and spears, arrows and muskets. But nowhere throughout the large extent of the Vanderbilt's possessions, or those of the other ruling families, are found warlike garrisons as evidence of ownership. Those uncouth barbarian methods are grossly antiquated. The part once played by armed battalions is now performed by bits of paper. A wondrously convenient change has it been. The owners of the resources of nations can disport themselves thousands of miles away from the scene of their ownership. They need never bestir themselves to provide measures for the retention of their property. Government, with its array of officials, prisons, armies, and navies, undertakes all of this protection for them. So long as they hold these bits of paper in their name, government recognizes them as the incontestable owners and safeguards their property accordingly. The very government established on the taxation of the workers is used to enforce the means by which the workers are held in subjection. I mean, ain't nothing new, obviously.
Where was it that he used the word vanilliquent? So a word that I genuinely had not heard before. Very weird. Very, very rare, that is, to encounter a word that I've literally never seen once.
Yes, that comes later in the Gould section, actually, on 345.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's in the Gould section. Right.
Well, Gould is really like definitely a great example of the praxis of everything that Myers just described in terms of like literally if you steal like a big bag full of stocks, like you become the owner. Which kind of is what ended up happening, but anyways, yes.
Yeah,
so, I mean,
the things that stick out to me, like from my memory of discussing Vanderbilt, were two things. One, like the sort of innovation of the usurious system of stocks and bonds, and like the way that they just made money from money through sheer gambling and maluse of stocks and bonds. And the other one was like his conduct during the Civil War, where he like sort of emerged as like a noted patriot or whatever, but he actually was like imperiling Union troops by like selling them like marked up like rotting ships.
Yes.
Because before he got into the railroads where he made his real fortune, he was in shipping.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
And so I think. Yeah, Myers gives a little background on his actual kind of, his background. And he was from Staten Island. And he didn't grow up rich, but he did grow up the son of a kind of, like a ferry. His dad basically ran a ferry business. Let me see right here. 106, that's where his biography begins. So Myers writes, the founders start. Vanderbilt was a rugged, headstrong, untamable, illiterate youth. At 12 years of age, he could scarcely write his own name, but he knew the ways of the water. When still a youth, he commenced ferrying passengers and freight between Staten Island and New York City. For books, he cared nothing. The refinements of life he scorned. His one passion was money. He was grasping and enterprising, coarse and domineering. Of the real details of his early life, little is known except what has been written by laudatory writers. We are informed that as he gradually made and saved money, he built his own schooners and went in for the coasting trade. The invention and success of the steamboat, it is further related, convinced him that the day of the sailing vessel would soon be over. He therefore sold his interest in his schooners and was engaged as captain of a steamboat plying between New York and points on the New Jersey coast. His wife, at the same time, enlarged the family revenues by running a wayside tavern at New Brunswick, New Jersey, whither Vanderbilt had moved. In 1829, when his resources reached $30,000, he quit as an employee and began building his own steamboats. Little by little, he drove many of his competitors out of business. This he was able to do by his harsh, unscrupulous, and strategic measures. He was severe with the men who worked for him, compelling them to work long hours for little pay. He showed a singular ability in undermining competitors. They could not pay low wages, but what he could pay lower. As rapidly as they set about reducing passenger and freight rates, he would anticipate them. His policy at this time was to bankrupt competitors and then, having obtained a monopoly, to charge exorbitant rates. The public, which welcomed him as a benefactor in declaring cheaper rates and which flocked to patronize his line, had to pay dearly for their premature and short-sighted joy. For the first 5 years, his profits, according to Crawford, reached $30,000 a year, doubling in successive years. By the time he was 40 years old, he ran steamboats to many cities on the coast and had amassed a fortune of $500,000. So that's the first mention of many, basically, of his hard-nosed, aggressive business tactics. So he goes on. I guess one of the big themes with Vanderbilt is bribery and commercial blackmail. So Myers writes that one of Vanderbilt's most effective means for harassing and driving out competition was in bribing the New York Common Council to give him and refuse them dock privileges. As the city owned the docks, the Common Council had the exclusive right of determining to whom they should be leased. Not a year passed but what the ship, ferry, and steamboat owners, the great landlords, and other capitalists bribed the aldermen to lease or give them valuable city property. Many scandals resulted, culminating in the great scandal of 1853 when the grand jury handed up a presentment showing in detail how certain aldermen had received bribes for disposal of the city's water rights, peer privileges, and other property, and how enormous sums had been expended in bribes to get railroad grants for the city. Vanderbilt was not openly implicated in these frauds, no more than were the Astors, the Rhinelanders, the Golets, and other very rich men who prudently kept in the background, and who managed to loot the city by operating through go-betweens. Vanderbilt's eulogists take great pains to elaborate upon his tremendous energy, sagacity, and constructive enterprise, as though these were the exclusive qualities by which he got his fortune. Such a glittering picture, common in all the usual biographies of rich men, discredits itself and is overthrown by the actual facts. The times in which Vanderbilt lived and thrived were not calculated to inspire the masses of people with respect for the trader's methods, although none could deny that the outcropping capitalists of the period showed a fierce vigor in overcoming obstacles of man and nature, and in extending their conquests toward the outpost of the habitable globe. He started bribing everybody, and Gustavus does note, if indomitable enterprise assured permanency of wealth, then many of Vanderbilt's competitors would have become and remained multimillionaires. Vanderbilt by no means possessed a monopoly of acquisitive enterprise. On every hand and in every line were men fully as active and unprincipled as he. Nearly all of these men, the scores of competitors in his own sphere, dominant capitalists in their day, have become well-nigh lost in the records of time. Their descendants are in the slough of poverty, genteel or otherwise. Those times were marked by the intensest commercial competition. Business was a labyrinth of sharp tricks and low cunning. The man who managed to protect his head far above the rest not only had to practice the methods of his competitors, but to overreach and outdo them. It was in this regard that Vanderbilt showed superior ability. In the exploitation of the workers, forcing them to work for low wages and compelling them to pay high prices for all necessities, Vanderbilt was no different from all contemporaneous capitalists. Capitalism subsisted by this process. Almost all conventional writers, it is true, set forth that it was the accepted process of the day, implying that it was a condition acquiesced in by the employer and worker. This is one of the lies disseminated for the purpose of proving that the great fortunes were made by legitimate methods. Far from being accepted by the workers, it was denounced and was openly fought by them at every auspicious opportunity. So eventually, Vanderbilt became one of the largest ship and steamboat builders in the United States and one of the most formidable employers of labor. At one time, he had 1,000 vessels afloat. Thousands of shipwrights, mechanics, and other workers toiled for him 14 and 16 hours a day at $1.50 a day for many years. The actual purchasing power of this wage kept declining as the cost of rent and other necessities of life advanced. This was notably so after the great gold discoveries in California, when prices of all commodities rose abnormally and the workers in every trade were forced to strike for higher wages in order to live. Most of these strikes were successful, but their results as far as wages went were barren. The advance wrung from employers was by no means equal to the increased cost of living. So, yeah, he built himself up. And, the other aspect of that was blackmail. So Myers writes, far from being the, quote, constructive genius that he is represented in every extant biographical work and note, Vanderbilt was the foremost mercantile pirate and commercial blackmailer of his day. Harsh as these terms may seem, they are more than justified by the facts. His eulogists, in line with those of other rich men, weave a beautiful picture for the edification of posterity of a broad, noble-minded man whose honesty was his sterling virtue and whose splendid ability in opening up and extending the country's resources was rewarded with a great fortune and the thanks of his generation. This is utterly false. He who has the slightest knowledge of the low practices and degraded morals of the trading class and of the qualities which ensured success might at once suspect the spuriousness of this extravagant presentation, even if the vital facts were unavailable. But there is no such difficulty. Obviously, for every one fraudulent commercial or political transaction that comes to public notice, hundreds and thousands of such transactions are kept in concealment. Enough facts, however, remain in official records to show the particular methods Vanderbilt used in getting together his millions. Yet no one hitherto seems to have taken the trouble to disinter them. Even serious writers, who cannot be accused of wealth worship or deliberate misstatement, have all, without exception, borrowed their narratives of Vanderbilt's career from the fiction of his literary newspaper and oratorical incense burners. And so it is that everywhere the conviction prevails that whatever fraudulent methods Vanderbilt employed in his later career, he was essentially an honest, straightforward man who was compelled by the promptings of sheer self-preservation to fight back at unscrupulous competitors or antagonists, and who innately was opposed to underhand work or fraud in any form. Vanderbilt is in every case portrayed as an eminently high-minded man who never stooped to dissimulation, deceit, or treachery, and whose first millions, at any rate, were made in legitimate ways of trade, as they were then understood. Next subheader, extortion and theft, common.
I love how he goes in on him as, another thing we have to remember to read before the end that we just kind of worked in there. Maybe we would have more time to explore it if we cut down on some of the stuff that was in this previously, but I love how he has no reverence for Vanderbilt, but also there's a great part about Theodore Roosevelt in this volume.
Oh yeah,
that just really goes in on him. But yeah, he calls him an illiterate and someone who just spewed profanity and jargon, and had no sophistication. This is actually a really good part that I don't know. I think that this comes just on the heels of the part about the the power of stocks and bonds. How stocks and bonds are imbued with the power of life and death, in sort of sweeping medieval type allegory. He is talking about the railroads in general, and he says, visualizing this power, one begins to get a vivid perception of the comprehensive sway of the Vanderbilt and of other railroad magnates. They levy tribute without restraint, a tribute so vast that the exactions of classic conquerors become dwarfed beside it. If this levying entailed only the seizing of money, that cold, unbreathing, lifeless substance, then human emotion might not start in horror at the consequences. But beneath it all are the tugging and tearing of human muscles and minds, the toil and sweat of an unnumbered multitude, the rending of homes, the infliction of sorrow, suffering, and death. Yeah, you really can see the sort of, there's definitely a Marxist influence here. He definitely shouts out socialism and socialists in his footnotes, and you can really see the sort of a labor theory of value kind of underrunning this, or the idea of a capitalism viewed with life. But he says, the magnates, as we have said, hold the power of decreeing life and death, and time never was since the railroads were first built when this power was not arbitrarily exercised. Millions have gone hungry or lived on an attenuated diet, while elsewhere harvests are rotted in the ground. Between their needs and nature's fertility lay the railroads. Organized and maintained for profit and for profit alone, the railroads carry produce and products at their fixed rates and not a whit less. If these rates are not paid, the transportation is refused. And as in these times transportation is necessary in the world's intercourse, the men who control it have the power to stand as an inflexible barrier between individuals, groups of individuals, nations, and international peoples. The very agencies which should, under a rational form of civilization, be devoted to promoting the interests of mankind, are used as their capricious self-interests incline them by the few who have been allowed to obtain control of them. What if helpless people are swept off by starvation or by diseases superinduced by lack of proper food? What if in the great cities an increasing sacrifice of innocence goes on because their parents cannot afford the price of good milk, a price determined to a large extent by railroad tariff? All this slaughter and more makes no impress upon the unimpressionable surfaces of these stocks and bonds, and leaves no record save in the hospitals and graveyards. The railroad magnates have other powers. Government itself has no power to blot a town out of existence. It cannot strew desolation at will. But the railroad owners can do it, and do not hesitate if sufficient profits be involved. One man sitting in a palace in New York can give an order declaring a secret discriminative tariff against the products of a place, whereupon its industry is no longer able to compete with formidable competitors enjoying better rates, closed down, the life of the place flickers and sometimes goes out. These are but a very few of the immensity of extravagant powers conferred by the ownership of these railroad bonds and stocks. Bonds they assuredly are, incomparably more so than the clumsy yokes of olden days. Society has improved its outward forms in these passing centuries. Clanking chains are no longer necessary to keep slaves in subjection. Far more effective than chains and balls and iron collars are the ownership of the means whereby men must live. Whoever controls them in large degree is a potentate, by whatever name he be called, and those who depend upon the owner of them for their sustenance are slaves by whatever flattering name they choose to go. Now, you could take issue with that in some respects, but I think it's very compelling the way that he talks about the sort of flow of life being interrupted by these machines and the implementation of their control by what he calls potentates, powers, basically, or agents of power.
Yes.
And, their ability to just, interfere in people's livelihood and to control, really, basically this whole system of stocks and bonds and papers and symbology is obscuring a way of exercising control, like a grotesque and sinister control over life itself, that's suffocating and
yes.
This
is truly like
destructive.
the dictatorship of like the capitalist overclass, basically like fully coming into fruition to a degree. Not that it wasn't already rigged from the very beginning, but yeah, I mean, where basically they do kind of have, in some cases they have privileges that like exceed patroonship, like before the American Revolution, in the sense that you could buy hundreds of thousands of acres of land like Bill Gates is doing today and kick anybody off of it, and the Supreme Court would basically
absolutely
like reify that as legal.
He does talk about that did occur to me. I think I'm not sure if that is mentioned in what we have preserved of our earlier recording, but
I think we did mention Bill Gates buying the land up.
Right. And definitely that did occur to me, and and it really talks about how, of course there's like vain or perfunctory separations of power and like antitrust maneuvers happening at this time, Theodore Roosevelt being an exponent of that. But ultimately, the government really is subservient and just does whatever these railroads want, whatever these railroad magnates and these capitalists desire. The government really is their implement for accomplishing it. What you were saying before really reminded me of this portion that I feel like we shouldn't gloss over, because it's kind of about the dissonance between the portrayal of these people and their actual moral character, which I found to be very interesting. And I do remember that we mentioned it previously. He goes on and says, the Vanderbilts are potentates. Their power is bounded by no law. They are among the handful of fellow potentates who say what law shall be and how it shall be enforced. No stern, masterful men and women are they, as some future moonstruck novelist or historian bent upon creating legendary lore may portray them. Voluptuaries are most of them, sunk in a surfeit of gorgeous living and riotous pleasure. Weak, without distinction of mind or heart, they have the money to hire brains to plan, plot, scheme, advocate, supervise, and work for them. Suddenly deprived of their stocks and bonds, they would find themselves adrift in the sheerest helplessness. With these stocks and bonds, they are the direct absolute masters of an army of employees. On the New York Central Railroad alone, the Vanderbilt payroll embraces 50,000 workers. This is but one of their railroad systems. As many more, or nearly as many, men work directly for them on their other railroad lines. You know, he just talks about how the interests and decisions of this family are supreme. He says, accepting the average of 5 to a family, here are 500,000 souls whose livelihood is dependent upon largely the will of the Vanderbilt family. To that will, there is no check. Today it may be expansively benevolent. Tomorrow, after a fit of indigestion or a night of demoralizing revelry, it may flit to an extreme of parsimonious retaliation. As the will fluctuates, so must be the fate of the 100,000 workers. So it's interesting that, you know, this sort of allusion to their sort of dissolute lifestyle, you know, he really emphasizes how they're involved in like these riotous parties and, you know, they don't have any healthful character. You know, I just wonder like what, you know, what were they doing at those
in
events,
sharp contradiction to the Protestant mythos of the hardest working person is ipso facto the most holy person. Probably my least favorite thing about Protestant Christianity. Basically the most pernicious idea that was cooked up in that cauldron of Calvinism. And I think most of these people actually were not, you know, model citizens by any means. And, you know, it's interesting to think about even today, you know, I'm sure that the assorted Vanderbilt heirs still control a lot of wealth and, you know, their money is in all kinds of trusts and things like that. But we still have, you know, a Vanderbilt yelling at us on the nightly news, telling us, you know, that we can't go to the grocery store unless we get a vaccine pass and hectoring us and trying to take our guns away and all that shit.
The whole Weber thing of the Protestant work ethic, I wonder, like, you know, I feel like we're all told that, and that's, like, supposed to be, like, this great intellectual insight, like that there's this sort of root in Calvinism, which perhaps, you know, we, in our later episode, this is weird, for the first time I'm alluding to an episode that is in the future, what will be said in it, but, in our later episode, we kind of mentioned the sort of Anglo-Dutch roots of some of the ruling class, and that's something that's a factor in the earlier volume of the History of the Great American Fortunes. And obviously, there's a huge Calvinist influence on, you know, Dutch Protestantism. You know, they very much cleave to a lot of those early settlers or patroons would have been influenced by, like, you know, the Calvinist doctrines of absolute depravity or things like that. But I wonder how much of that, I mean, maybe it does have some deep roots there, but I wonder, like, whether Protestantism itself, you know, not to go too easy on them, but I wonder, like, how much of that is like a scapegoat for, like, whatever the, you know, depraved inclinations of, like, these particular people, like, are, you know. He does mention, you know, there is one guy later on, Drew, right? Am I thinking of the right person? His right-hand man.
Oh, his lawyer.
Who would be doing all the betting for him on the stock market.
Yeah, Chauncey Depew.
Is that right?
I think it is. Yeah, Vanderbilt's reptoid lawyer is what I wrote down. And he became a senator from New York in the early 1900s.
Well, was he the same one? I feel like...
There was Drew. Drew might have been. I think Drew was Gould's person, or I forget. We'll have to go deeper. I forget.
We'll
Drew
find
was
it eventually.
The guy who was. He was either despoiled. I think he was despoiled by Gould, I believe, and they dumped him. Remember, after their whole scandal.
Yeah, they're right. Gould and Vanderbilt. Gould betrayed Vanderbilt with Drew, and and then after he was betrayed, he, like, crept under his covers and made all these sort of religious, you know, appeals for clemency, and kind of, like, just collapsed into, like, a religious torpor because he still, like, was, you know, sort of had a streak of orthodoxy in him, despite just being, you know, very, like, you know,
rapacious,
reprobate person. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing to keep in mind, and I think it's something we're still in the process of getting to the bottom of, is the kind of cultural shift that went on particularly in, like, the Ivy League colleges and places like Yale and Harvard, but particularly focusing on Yale, where that was a university that basically existed to train, like, preachers, reverends, right? Like clergy. It was a place to
that was a while before at this point, though.
Well, it was, but I think as we've talked about elsewhere, certain families that were sending their children to go to Yale to become clergy were still sending their children. The descendants of those people were sending their children to go to Yale in the 1800s and the 1900s to become businessmen. And so you have to, I'm sure there was always some kind of overlap between those two things, but it really seemed like the ascendancy, especially of things like Skull and Bones, which is like, how do you square Skull and Bones with, a kind of university that's designed to build a good Christian clergymen, and then you have this like German death cult society where you have to like lie in a coffin full of shit, like cradling Geronimo's skull while everyone like pees on you and you have to tell them all your secrets. Like, how did that evolve, right? Because it seems like there's a spiritual shift, if you will, and a full pivot towards business as almost like business is the religion in a kind of way. I don't want to necessarily speak like too literally, but it feels that way, right? That business became like the true religion. I guess that.
Yeah, I think of the 19th century, like if you think about the Skull and Bones, like I've seen Skull and Bones Hall, it's called The Tomb. And at Harvard, they have a similar thing, like a weird, like kind of tomb for their secret society that exists there. I forget exactly what's the Harvard one called? Is it
I always
not
forget
as notorious?
I always forget about the Harvard ones, what they're called. They don't get talked about as much.
No, yeah, they definitely don't. But their building is also very odd looking. But I think that those were, at least in the case of the Skull and Bones Hall, I think that was roughly contemporary, or at least there were, I think that they actually designed it for the Skull and Bones, right? Like it was constructed for them, like in that, 19th century Gothic style, or at least around that time.
Yeah, most of the oldest secret societies, I think Book and Snake was the same
Skull
way.
And Bones Hall,
Scabbard
otherwise known as the Tomb.
Scroll and Key, that was the other one.
It was built in 3 phases. The first wing was built in 1856, the second wing in 1903, and Davis-designed neo-Gothic towers were added to the rear guard in 1912. The front and side facades and the other Portland brownstone in Egypto-Doric style. That's, just from Wikipedia. But you can see in the architecture, like the sort of neoclassical influences, like of everything that was in the air at the time, like spiritualism kind of, after the, the Skull and Bones itself predates the Second World War, but especially after the Second World War, predates the Civil War. But after the Civil War especially, when there's this mass death, people obviously experienced a little bit of disillusionment, and there's an element of that, like just in the general milieu of the early 19th century as well, and the lead up to the Civil War. I think that there definitely was like an aspect of certainly the sort of puritanical religion or the religious seriousness that prevailed at that time. In the earlier centuries, certainly did start to wane. The 9th century was a very different time in terms of that orientation, I think, in the United States.
I think that's where you saw a lot of these high Protestants.
Classes,
like the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians, probably most notably, kind of it became more of like a social thing. But that's why Roger Ebert could say in the 80s, like Protestantism for people who sort of want a religion. Like that's a common I think attack, or maybe less so today, but that's a common attack probably in like the mid to late 20th century when the term WASP was coined by an alum of St. Anthony Hall. And the idea that these kind of like fuddy-duddy high Episcopalians like really weren't like religious at all, but it was almost like a tradition you had to keep up of, everyone goes to like the First Presbyterian Church and you belong to this thing. But really, compared to maybe like other religions that were around in America at that time, like either more sort of evangelical type ones or like Catholics, they were kind of just going through the motions of their religiosity, but it really was kind of, it's like in There'll Be Blood when they ask Daniel Plainview if he's a religious man, and he's like, I'm a celebrator of many faiths. Like, like it's like obviously he did know he's fucking not religious.
I think another like concern that's sort of adjacent to this, like outside of like the specifics of like the religious belief or the sort of doctrine that's being cleaved to or followed, something that I do recall us speaking about when we did this episode before, whether or not it's the part that we've manage to hold on to or not, if it's in that part. We did talk a little bit about like whether these people feel bad, whether they really do have a moral sensibility, and like whether they know that what they're doing is wrong because they've done truly egregious things. I think we'll talk in a moment about Vanderbilt's Civil War activities, and then we'll probably talk about like Gould's gold conspiracy and all these things. Like, do they have like a sense that what they're doing is wrong? I think maybe it varies, but I think that it is telling. I think that in the case of, I should really look up his names to see like whether it was in fact Drew, but I'm pretty sure that it was. But Gould's associate in betraying Vanderbilt, the fact that he would, then after being betrayed, just sort of collapse into, an upswell of religious feeling, that I think is in a way telling, like that he might have had some sort of sensibility that what he was involved in outside of like, I think that maybe there's sort of a tendency to read it like, he was washed up and now he was kind of almost superstitiously or selfishly appealing to get out of the situation that he was in. But maybe it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in a way of all the activities that he was involved in, like all of the sort of just manipulating money, like causing railroads to crash, like purposefully, like letting them just deteriorate and become like incredibly accident prone.
Not crash on the stock market, though he would do that too.
Right, yeah,
literally
true.
Crash,
Sorry. Yeah, that could be confusing. No, exactly. Not cause like the stock market or the sort of, the railroad company to crash or its profile in the stock market to plummet, although that would be a result which then could be exploited. But literally, like the railroads would have to materially physically crash and people would have to die because like these people, even though they were all about gaining control of the railroad industry, they didn't care at all about or know anything about the maintenance of railroads or how to maintain them. So they just completely let them fall apart a lot of the time, and they, in some cases, did that deliberately and were in fact encouraged by the market to do it because it was a strategy for them.
It's such a good counterpoint to any kind of like lib or conservative or bourgeois discourse about how basically the kind of Chicago school era of like capitalism like provides the most efficient services through competition, and it's like actually this incentive structure is like deeply satanic and fucked up and actually is not rational on top of that.
No, it is really not. Like when we we should talk about like the Civil War thing, and then we should move to like the gold conspiracy and some of the actual like nitty gritty of the railroad stuff, because you really see how this is like not in any way like an outgrowth of any like system that follows any kind of actual like logic at all. Like it seems like deliberately
like a grift, basically.
How, like the cruelty is the point, like which may have been insightful at one point, but is now like deteriorated into like just an annoying live mantra. Like it almost does feel that is the case in the way that a lot of these things are worked out from at least Myers'
harvesting
description of them.
Souls.
The gold
money.
Room and everything is just outrageous.
Yes. I mean, this is what happens when like you don't have any, like broader moral strictures against like this type of behavior in terms of economic activity.
Or that like the caprice and the whims, as he wrote, like they are able to determine what the law is, and there is no like higher principle of moral law that they are accountable to at all. Like their whims decide the law. I think we mentioned in the probably the lost part of this episode, I think, presume we lost everything that we said about Vanderbilt then. I think we mentioned how, it's kind of like a naive sort of refrain from some quarters, like that we need to raise taxes, on the most wealthy, but like they determine what is taxed. Like they determine taxes on their commodities and what the taxes on them are. So like when you hear someone like Warren Buffett being like, I would welcome these taxes, well, that's never going to happen. It's a complete non-starter because it's not like there is actually like a separate or autonomous entity that's going to be able to impose these taxes. Like they are the ones who determine what the tax structure and the taxes are.
Absolutely. And we see that again and again. Yeah, just like with Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, like none of these motherfuckers are still not paying taxes. And actually, Myers makes an interesting point. He kind of flips it on its head in this section by arguing that, in fact, it is the corporations that tax us, that tax its workers, that tax the customers, that tax the public treasury, and basically, but particularly the railroads. Because he kind of says that, you know, as much control that like Rockefeller can have via Standard Oil to basically quote unquote tax everybody else, you know, for his benefit at their expense via oil is a very powerful thing because oil is a central commodity. But the railroad is even better for a kind of rapacious corporate, you know, tax hoarder because you get to put a tax on the transit of everything, of people, of commodities, of just about everything else. And basically, if people can't pay the freight rates, which fluctuated all the fucking time back in the day in like egregious kind of profit gouging kind of ways, then you couldn't ship your commodities on the train. So they had immense leverage. But before we get to that, I just want to run through real quick, like how did he make it from steamboat business owner to basically the railroad tycoon in really the span of like a decade, from like the 1850s to the 1860s. Well, I guess as Myers said it, the first thing he did was he figured out how to grift off the federal government through kind of fraudulently fleecing them on the mail trade. So I'll just read a little bit here, and then we'll move on to the Civil War real quick, and then we'll get to the airport. I think we could power through this part of the biography. Mm-hmm. So Myers asked, like, how did Vanderbilt manage to extort millions of dollars from the federal government? The method was one of great simplicity. Many of its features were brought out in the U.S. Senate in the debate of June 1858 over the mail steamship bill. The government had begun more than a decade back the policy of paying heavy subsidies to steamship companies for the transportation of mail. This subsidy, however, was not the only payment received by the steamship owners. In addition, they were allowed what were called postages, the full returns from the amount of postage on the letters carried. Ocean postage at that time was enormous and burdensome, and was especially onerous upon a class of persons least able to bear it. About 3/4 of the letters transported by ships were written by emigrants. They were taxed the usual rate of 24 or 29 cents for a single letter. In 1851, the amount received for transatlantic postages was not less than $1 million. 3/4 of this sum came directly from the working class. So to get these subsidies, in conjunction with the postages, the steamship owners, by one means or another, corrupted postal officials and members of Congress. Quote, and this is one of our rare, like, based bourgeois politicians that tried to fight back. I have noticed, said Senator Toombs in a speech in the Senate in 1858, that there has never been a head of a department strong enough to resist steamship contracts. I have noticed them here with your Whig Party and your Democratic Party for the last 13 years, and I have never seen any head of a department strong enough to resist these influences. 13 years' experience has taught me that wherever you allow the Post Office or Navy Department to do anything which is for the benefit of contractors, you may consider the thing is done. I could point to more than a dozen of these contracts. $1 million a year is a power that will be felt. For 10 years, it amounts to $10 million, and I know it is felt. I know it perverts legislation. I have seen its influence. I have seen the public treasury plundered by it. So, by means of this systematic corruption, the steamship owners received many millions of dollars of government funds. This was all virtually plunder. The returns from the postages far more than paid for the transportation of mails. And what became of these millions in loot? Part went in profits to the owners, and another part was used as private capital by them to build more and newer ships constantly. Practically none of Vanderbilt's ships cost him a cent. The government funds paid for their building. In fact, a careful tracing of the history of all the subsidized steamship companies proves that this plunder from the government was very considerably more than enough to build and equip their entire lines. And so then Myers describes real quick a kind of this interesting feud that developed between E.K. Collins and Company, which was a steamship line that ran from New York to Liverpool. And he says Collins debauched the postal officials in Congress so effectively that in 1847 he obtained appropriation of $387,000 a year, and subsequently an additional appropriation of $475,000 for 5 years. Together with the postages, these amounts made a total mail subsidy for that one line alone during the latter years of the contract about $1 million a year. And then basically he got in trouble because the reauthorization of this payment was brought under scrutiny by people like Senator Toombs. And then they're basically this debate in the Senate. Some remarkable facts came out as to how the government was being steadily plundered, and people wanted to know why it was the postal system was already burdened with a deficit of $5 million. While the appropriation bill was being solemnly discussed with patriotic exclamations, lobbyists of the various steamship companies busied themselves with influencing or purchasing votes within the very halls of Congress. And almost the entire Senate was occupied for days with advocating this or that side as if they were paid attorneys pleading for the interest of either Collins or Vanderbilt. Already a bitter conflict was raging between these two millionaires. Vanderbilt's subsidized European lines ran to Southampton, Havre, and Bremen, Collins to Liverpool. There were indications that for years a secret understanding had been enforced between Collins and Vanderbilt by which they divided the mail subsidy funds. Ostensibly, however, in order to give no sign of collusion, they went through the public appearance of warring upon each other. By this stratagem, they were able to ward off criticism of monopoly and each get a larger appropriation than if it were known that they were in league. But it was characteristic of business methods that while in collusion, Vanderbilt and Collins constantly sought to wreck the other. One senator after another arose with perfervid effusion of either Collins or Vanderbilt. The Collins supporters gave out the most suave arguments why the Collins line should be heavily subsidized and why Collins should be permitted to change his European port to Southampton. Vanderbilt's retainers fought this move, which they declared would wipe out of existence the enterprise of great and patriotic capitalists. More on that in a minute. It was at this point that Senator Toombs, who represented neither side, cut in with a series of charges which dismayed the whole lobby for the time being. He denounced both Collins and Vanderbilt as plunderers, and then in so many words specifically accused Vanderbilt of having blackmailed millions of dollars. This is a real money quote here for everyone that thinks, like, conspiracies don't matter. I am trying, said Senator Toombs, to protect the government against collusion, not against conflict. I do not know but that these parties have colluded now. I have not the least doubt that all these people understand one another. I am struggling against collusion. If they've colluded, why should Vanderbilt run to Southampton for the postage when Collins can get $387,000 for running to the same place? Why may not Collins then sell his ships, sit down in New York, and say to Vanderbilt, I will give you $230,000 and pocket $157,000 a year? That is the plain, naked case. The senator from Vermont says the Postmaster General will protect us. That ain't nothing new. It is my duty in the first place to prevent collusion and prevent the country from being plundered, to protect it by law as well as I can. And then there was a whole conspiracy. Well, just run, I won't even quote it real quick, of basically the mail lines running to California. And it came out, this is, proven in the Senate trial, that I guess the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and the United States Mail Steamship Company, which are called the Harris and Slough lines, Toombs alleged on the Senate floor that Vanderbilt, threatening them with both competition and a public agitation such as would uncover the fraud, had forced them to pay him gigantic sums in return for his silence and inactivity. Responsible capitalists, Senator Toombs said, had offered to carry the mails to California for $550,000. Everybody knows, he said, that it can be done for half the money we pay now. Why then should we continue to waste the public money? You give $900,000 a year to carry the mails to California, and Vanderbilt compels the contractors to give him $56,000 a month to keep quiet. This is the effect of your subventions. They pay lobbymen, they pay agencies, they go to law because everybody is to have something. And I know this Slough contract has been in Chancery in New York for years. The result of this system is that here comes a man, as old Vanderbilt seems to be. I never saw him, but his operations have excited my admiration. And he runs right at them and says, disgorge this plunder. He is the kingfish that is robbing these small plunderers that come about the capital. He does not come here for that purpose, but he says, fork over $56,000 a month of this money to me, that I may lie in port with my ships. And they do it. So basically, other people were ripping off the government, and Vanderbilt found out and basically said, I'm going to rat on you unless you pay me like a vig every month of the amount that you're stealing from the government.
Right.
So he plundered the plunderers, basically.
Yeah. There was a lot of that going on. Yeah, he was completely hypocritical in the way that he conducted himself. There's an amazing anecdote later about when Gould basically cheated him out of a bunch of money by sort of conspiring with his associate who was Daniel Drew, and basically he then was calling the police about how he'd been defrauded and trying to rally them and go to the courts and everything, and they were like, well, we'll just do what you taught us to do, which is like bribe the legislature. And then, it's just...
Yeah. Exactly. They learn the tricks of the game. And yeah, just for the record, if anybody who's like, that's unsubstantiated, I think the head of either the Harris or the Slough line, Fisher, in 1860, testified, during the period of about 4 years and a half, I was one of the trustees of the steamship line. The earnings of the line were very large, but the greater part of the money was wrongfully appropriated to Vanderbilt for blackmail and to others on various pretexts. So even Horace F. Clark, Vanderbilt's son-in-law, one of the trustees of the United States Mail Steamship Company, likewise admitted the transaction. And of course, Myers notes, it is quite useless to ask whether Vanderbilt was criminally prosecuted or civilly sued by the government. Not only was he unmolested, but 2 years later, as we shall see, he carried out another huge swindle upon the government under peculiarly heinous conditions. Us to the Civil War, right? And this is a pretty fascinatingly notorious period of Vanderbilt's career where he discovers the bounty of war profiteering in probably one of the more egregious examples in American history, of which there are many, right?
This is something that he actually was criticized and indicted for, and he was brought, before Congress to sort of justify what he did, but of course he got completely away with it and was able to shift blame totally onto someone else, basically, who was his broker. But yeah, it was so outrageous that for once he actually did get in a little bit of trouble. Well, he didn't really get in trouble. He got in superficial trouble, as he did a couple times throughout his career, but nothing actually came of it, and he was completely unpunished. But yes.
So basically what he sees at the beginning of the Civil War, with the disruption of shipping routes and the scouring of the seas by privateers, that business was basically on a sharp secular downturn. And basically American ship owners had like an assortment of superfluous vessels on their hands and kind of, no way to make money with them. So Vanderbilt went looking for new openings, and he wanted to offload these ships and then also find another way of making millions of dollars. So the first thing he did, these vessels, Myers writes, were of such scandalous construction that foreign capitalists would not buy them at any price. Hastily built in the brief period of 90 days, wholly with a view to immediate profit and with but a perfunctory regard for efficiency, many of these steamers were in a dangerous condition. That they survived voyages was perhaps due more to luck than anything else. Year after year, vessel after vessel, similarly built and owned, had gone down to the bottom of the ocean. Collins had lost many of his ships, so had other steamship companies. And, the chronicles of sea travel were a long, gruesome succession of tragedies. Thousands of immigrants, inhumanly crowded in the enclosures of the steerage, were swept to death without even a fighting chance for life. Cabin passengers fared better. They were given the opportunity of taking to the lifeboats in cases where there was sufficient warning, time, and room. So a lot of death as well, just like the railroads, a lot of death on the sea due to the cutting corners that, people like Vanderbilt engaged in. So he decided, why not why not palm these vessels upon the government? A highly favorable time it was. The government, under the imperative necessity of at once raising and transporting a huge army, needed vessels badly. As for the other question, momentarily agitating the capitalists as to what new line of activity they could substitute for their own extinguished business, Vanderbilt soon showed how railroads could be made to yield a far greater fortune than commerce. So, I mean, basically...
And by the way, you know, they were being lauded at the time for their patriotism because of what they were doing, because they were providing these ships. You know, Myers writes, as one of the foremost capitalists at the time, Cornelius Vanderbilt has been constantly exhibited as a great and shining patriot. Precisely in the same way as Crofut makes no mention of Vanderbilt's share in mail subsidy frauds, but on the contrary, ascribes to Vanderbilt the most splendid patriotism in his mail-carrying operations. So do Crofut and other writers unctuously dilate. I've never heard this before. Like, I know the word dilate, but I've never heard it used in this way. Upon the old magnate's patriotic services during the Civil War. Such a sort of romancing that has long gone unquestioned, although the genuine facts have been within reach. These facts show that Vanderbilt was continuing during the Civil War the prodigious frauds he had been carrying on. When Lincoln's administration decided in 1862 to send large military and naval forces to New Orleans under General Banks, one of the first considerations was to get in haste the required number of ships to be used as transports. And, you know, to whom did the government turn in this exigency? To the very merchant class which, since the foundation of the United States, continuously defrauded the public treasury. You know, like you said, the owners of the ships have been eagerly waiting a chance to sell or lease them to the government at exorbitant prices. And to whom was the business of buying, equipping, and supervising them entrusted? To none other than Cornelius Vanderbilt. So everyone was praising him for being what a patriot he was, and just talking about how he was this really great man, even though of course like all these people like basically bought their way out of having to actually fight, and
and I assume their children as well.
Exactly.
And he was old at this point, but
they took excellent care. He says that their own bodies should not be imperiled. Inspired by enthusiasm or principle, a great way the working class, including the farming and the professional elements, volunteered for military service. It was not long before they experienced disappointment and demoralization of camp life. You know, he talks about how we have their letters and everything, as you can see, like on a Ken Burns documentary. But the property classes of the North loved comfort and power too well to look tranquilly upon any move to force them to enlist. But the government, once more, revealed that it was but a register of the interests of the ruling classes, and the Draft Act was actually changed so that men of property could escape being conscripted into the army if they bought substitutes. So they get those Irish immigrants, like in gangs in New York, like coming right off the boat, just give them a Union uniform. Rich people didn't have to; they could just buy substitutes. But anyway, so what you said about the Immigration Act, or the condition of immigrant ships. What he actually ended up providing to the military for use in the war was actually worse. And that's why it was such a grave public scandal, as Myers writes. He was known to be mercenary and unscrupulous, yet he was selected by Secretary of War Stanton to act as the agent for the government. At this time, Vanderbilt was posing as a glorious patriot with much ostentation. He had loaned to the government for an able purpose one of his ships. A ship that he could not put to use himself, and which, in fact, had been built with stolen public funds. By this gift, he had cheaply attained the reputation of being a fervent patriot. Subsequently, it may be added, Congress turned a trick on him by assuming that he gave the ship to the government, and to his great astonishment, kept the ship and solemnly thanked him for the present. So, the outfitting of this expedition was of such rank character that it provoked a grave public scandal. If the matter had been simply one of swindling the United States Treasury out of millions of dollars, it might have been passed over by Congress. On all sides, gigantic frauds were being committed by the capitalists. But in this particular case, the protests of the thousands of soldiers on board the transports were too numerous and effective to be silenced or ignored. These soldiers were not regulars without influence or connections. They were volunteers who everywhere had relatives and friends to demand an inquiry. Their complaints of overcrowding and of insecure, broken-down ships poured in and aroused the whole country. A great stir resulted. Congress appointed an investigating committee. The testimony was extremely illuminative. It showed that in buying the vessels, Vanderbilt had employed one T.J. Southard, this is the guy who actually basically went down for him, to act as his handyman. Vanderbilt, it was testified by numerous ship owners, refused to charter any vessels unless the business were transacted through Southard, who demanded a share of the purchase money before he would consent to do business. Any ship owner who wanted to get rid of a superannuated steamer or sailing vessel found no difficulty if he acceded to Southard's terms. The vessels accepted by Vanderbilt and contracted to be paid for at high prices were in shockingly bad condition. Vanderbilt was one of the few men in the secret of the destination of Banks' expedition. He knew that ships had to make an ocean trip, yet he bought for $10,000 the Niagara, an old boat that had been built nearly a score of years before for trade on Lake Ontario. Sorry, a little blur on this page. In perfectly smooth weather, reported Senator Grimes of Iowa, with a calm sea, the planks were ripped out of her and exhibited to the gaze of the indignant soldiers on board, showing that her timbers were rotten. The committee have in their committee room a large sample of one of the beams of this vessel to show that it does not have the slightest capacity to hold a nail. So he gave them literally a rotting ship that was meant to travel on a lake in calm water, and he was it will sail across the ocean. He also refused, it was sort of a regulation that ships should have navigators. If you're gonna send them across the ocean, you're supposed to provide navigators, but he refused to do that because that would have cost, that would have been his expense.
Yeah.
When the question was asked of Commodore Vanderbilt, of course, Commodore Vanderbilt, and of the other gentlemen in connection with the expedition, why it was that they refused to hire more than one navigator and failed to provide instruments and charts, why they did not take them, the answer was that the insurance companies and owners of the vessel took that risk, as though, Senator Grimes bitingly continued, the government had no risk in the lives of its valiant men whom it had enlisted under its banner and set out in an expedition of this kind.
Yeah. Senator Grimes really caustically denounced Vanderbilt. He said the whole transaction shows a chapter of fraud from beginning to end, men making the most open professions of loyalty and of patriotism and of perfect disinterestedness, coming before the committee and swearing that they acted from such motives solely, were compelled to admit, at least one or two were, that in some instances they received as high as 6.25%. That was the royalty or the finder's fees they charge. And I believe that since then the committee are satisfied in their own mind that the percent was greater than was in testimony before them. Senator Grimes added that he did not believe that Vanderbilt's name should be stricken from the resolution. In vain, however, did Senator Grimes plead. Vanderbilt's name was expunged, and Southard was made the chief scapegoat. Although Vanderbilt had been tenderly dealt with in the investigation, his criminality was conclusively established. The affair deeply shocked the nation. After all, it was only another of many tragic events demonstrating both the utter inefficiency of capitalist management and the consistent capitalist program of subordinating every consideration of human life to the mania for profits. Vanderbilt was only a type of his class. Although he was found out, he deserved condemnation no more than thousands of other capitalists, great and small, whose methods at bottom did not vary from his. Yet such was the network of shams and falsities with which the supreme class of the time enmeshed society that press, pulpit, university, and the so-called statesmen insisted that the wealth of the rich man had its foundation in ability, and that this ability was indispensable in providing for the material wants of mankind. Ouch.
There
Fire.
ain't nothing new under the sun.
There truly ain't nothing new under the sun. All the fucking infrastructure of the internet was built off of DARPA money and research grants from the taxpayers, and now Jeff Bezos gets to ride around in his dick rocket.
All these different social institutions, just completely collaborate in enforcing the idea that everyone, the wealth of these people is based on ability, that they deserve it in some way.
This is the ontological premise that cannot be even brought up because it is so much the weather, as I think
it is.
It's the weather. What is it? David Remnick said once about the New York Times.
I don't remember where it's the weather.
I think it was a Mark Maron interview. What do you think about the New York Times? And he was like, it's the weather.
I felt like it was Watchmen.
Oh, maybe it was something else.
I thought it was the show Watchmen that was the weather for some reason.
I think it was older than that. They said some horrible things too.
Yeah.
But they definitely believe the New York Times is the weather. But so is making excuses for bloodthirsty capitalists and all of their, rapacious deeds. From press, pulpit to university, and the so-called statesmen, they're all just caping super hard. Yeah, so basically, he makes a bunch of money and doesn't get in trouble for any of that, and then he's able, kind of around the same time, to kind of parlay that wealth into what really is the big jackpot of his life, which is railroads. And I think we can just run through it real quick because it's very labyrinthine. It involves so much corruption, so much fraud, so much blackmail.
Highlights. When he basically just, in order to get control of New York Central, he just refused to let anyone travel like through Albany because he controlled like the connection. So basically, like, he shut down travel completely and like totally abdicated like any sense of like his duty to people to help them travel, like as the owner of the railroad, just so that like the stock of the New York Central would go down and he would be able to like acquire it easily. Yeah, there's lots of
the levels of stock manipulation between like different companies that he owned, like taking the stock of one and juicing the stock of another, using shorts and things like the short selling and things like that. He was able to just like, I'm pretty sure most of what he made his fortune on is, at least on the books, illegal today, because we have like the SEC and some kind of laws.
I don't know. I almost feel like he basically like established. I just feel like the reason why like it was. I know. I almost feel the opposite, that like now there are just like more robust systems in place for like formalizing everything that he did and just making it a feature of the system.
That's a good point.
Streamlining it. Yeah.
Maybe some of the specific tactics that he used, like basically like bribing people, insider trading, things like that would be illegal. But the ability to like own gigantic concerns or sit on the board of like 70 different corporations or something, and then kind of not be looked at
and just
for
play
conflict
them
of
against
interest.
each other. And basically like, because he owned both of them, he would be able to, like use one to like compete with the other, and thereby like manipulate the prices of the stocks.
Yes. And as you mentioned earlier, like Myers says, like, this competition didn't lead to the improvement of the railroads. In fact, the various railroads that he bought were juggled with by succeeding groups of manipulators. Management was neglected and no attention paid to proper equipment. Often the physical layout of the railroads, the roadbeds, rails, and cars were deliberately allowed to deteriorate in order that the manipulators might be able to lower the value and efficiency of the road and thus depress the value of the stock. Thus, for instance, Vanderbilt, aiming to get control of a railroad at a low price, might very well have confederates among some of the directors or officials of that railroad who would resist or slyly thwart every attempted improvement, and so scheme that the profits would constantly go down. As the profits decreased, so did the price of the stock in the stock market. The changing combinations of railroad capitalists were too absorbed in the process of gambling in the stock market to have any direct concern for management. It was nothing to them that this neglect caused frequent and heart-rending disasters. They were not held criminally responsible for the loss of life. In fact, the railroad wrecks often served their purpose in beating down the price of stocks. Incredible as this statement may seem, it is abundantly proved by the facts. So like literally like sacrificing souls to like manipulate the stock price. This is when you see like the simulacra almost becoming more important than like the thing that it's signifying. You know what I mean? Like, it really it takes on like, it becomes kind of this abstract entity that is separate from the thing that it purports to represent, right? And leads to that. So basically, it's like it literally does not matter in this system whether you're improving a railroad or you're just, or also, talk about like, who cares about conspiracies? That's dumb. That sounds pretty much like he was engaging in criminal conspiracies to have like double agents inside of rival railroads that he wanted to buy to like purposely sabotage them. So like leading to death and destruction so that he could buy it at a lower price. That sounds pretty...
It's not possible for there to be any kind of double agent, because if enough people knew about the double agent, then... it would just find, if you hit
like more than 50
people.
Oh
yeah.
That's true.
Well, I guess probably he kept it under 50 people who knew about his double agents in the other railroads. This is a great part, just about it's called He Annexes a Second Railroad. Having found it so easy to get one railroad, he promptly went ahead to annex other railroads. By 1864, he loomed up as the owner of a controlling mass of stock in the New York and Hudson River Railroad. This line paralleled the Hudson River and had a terminal in the downtown section of New York City. In a way, it was a competitor of the New York and Harlem Railroad. The old magnate now conceived a brilliant idea. Why not consolidate the two roads? True, to bring about this consolidation, an authorizing act of the New York legislature was necessary, but there was little doubt of the legislature backing Vanderbilt, no doubt of them balking. Vanderbilt, there's like no periods in the copy that I have for some reason. Vanderbilt well knew the means to ensure its passage. In those years, when the people were taught to look upon competition as indispensable, there was a deep popular opposition to the consolidating of competing interests. This, it was feared, would inflict monopoly. The cost of buying legislatures to pass an act so provocative of popular indignation would be considerable, but at the same time, it would not be more than a trifle compared with the immense profits he would gain. The consolidation would allow him to increase, or as the phrase went, water, the stock of the combined roads. Although substantially owner of the two railroads, he was legally two separate entities, this is what we were just mentioning, or rather, the corporations were. As the owner of one line, he could bargain with himself as the owner of the other and could determine what the exchange purchase price should be. So by a juggle, he could, issue
Love to
enormous
compete
quantities.
with myself.
Right, yeah. And these many millions of bonds and stocks would not cost him personally a cent. The sole expense, the bribe funds, and the cost of engraving, he would charge against his corporations. Immediately, these stocks and bonds would be vested with a high value, inasmuch as they would represent mortgages upon the productivity of tens of millions of people of that generation, and still greater numbers of future generations. By putting up traffic rates and lowering wages, dividends could be paid upon the entire outpouring of stock, thus beyond a doubt ensuring its permanent value. And this section, cunning against cunning. The numerous millions taken in by Vanderbilt in these transactions came from a host of other men who would have plundered him as quickly as he plundered them. They came from members of the legislature who had grown rich on bribes for granting continuous succession of special privileges, or to put it in a more comprehensible form, licenses to individuals and corporations to prey in 1,001 forms upon the people. They came from bankers, railroad, land, and factory owners, all of whom had assiduously bribed Congress, legislatures, common councils, and administrative officials to give them special laws and rights by which they could all the more easily and securely grasp the produce of the many and hold it intact without even a semblance of taxation. The very nature of that system of gambling called stock market or cotton or produce exchange speculation showed at once the sharply defined disparities and discriminations in law. Common gambling, so-called, was a crime. The gambling of the exchanges was legitimate and legalized, and the men who thus gambled with the resources of the nation were esteemed as highly respectable and responsible leaders of the community. For a penniless man to sell anything he did not own, or which was not in existence, was held a heinous crime and was severely punished by a long prison term. But the members of the all-powerful propertied class could contract to deliver stocks which they did not own, or which were non-existent, or they could gamble in produce often not yet out of the ground, and the law saw no criminal act in their performances. Far from being under the inhibition of the law, these methods were duly legalized. So, because they made the code of laws as it stood, and if any doubter denies that laws at all times have exactly corresponded with the interests and aims of the ruling class, all that is necessary is to compare the laws of the different periods with the profitable methods of that class, and he will find that these methods, however despicable, vile, and cruel, were not only indulgently omitted from the recorded category of crimes, but were elevated by prevalent teaching to be commercial virtues and ability of a high order.
Oof, damn. Yeah, spitting that fire. Exactly.
Yes.
Like, literally, we live in this world still.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then he grabbed a third railroad, the New York Central, one of the richest in the country. And, he basically kept this pattern going of, consolidating, buying railroads, consolidating them, playing them against each other, not actually putting up any money himself. I love it that all these people, I think it says later that it was either Vanderbilt or Gould who, expensed their bribes, to the corporations they worked for. Mm-hmm. So it's they found a line item in the budget for legislative expenses or something like that, $500,000. They're like, I forget what that was about. Yeah, but they literally, it's they don't put up their own money. That's another thing that's so fucking obnoxious. It's they put up their own money, so they deserve to benefit.
Yeah.
I guess the venture capital.
They're self-made.
Yeah, self-made. No, their money made that, which is to say, the people who the money employed to actually built it.
Well, they were literally able to do things like promise to deliver something that didn't exist just because, they had the incredible wealth to legitimize this and allow it to happen.
Yeah, and I think they tried to put a profit limit in New York on if the railroad's profits exceeded something like 10%, then the people would have the representatives would vote on basically they would take that profit and return it to the public treasury. But I feel that law was just completely flouted and ignored, probably because he bribed everybody that would have enforced it. So you can clearly see the popular distaste for monopoly almost all the way down, not just from the vast working classes, but also from the middle class competitors, which I think throughout this volume Myers mentions a few times how they were kind of batted in between the great poor masses and the silk toppers. And they increasingly felt this anxiety that the rise of the trusts and the monopolies and these huge corporations were going to kind of eat their lunch and make them obsolete.
Yeah, we mentioned that. It was. Yeah. I hope that was in the part that is preserved, maybe. But yeah, we talked about how like it's funny to hear him like basically lament the demise of the middle class. Well, I guess he's not lamenting because he rightly recognizes that they're also exploiters of the working class, and they're just upset because their ability to do so is being sucked away into the ruling class, and their class position is disappearing. But it's interesting to see him discuss the disappearance of the middle class, even like in this time in 1910.
100 years ago.
This is something that exactly. More than 100 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're still dealing with it today, and you still hear about that anxiety, like the disappearing middle class, and like small businesses being taken over by Google, like the new trusts, the new mega corporations, which the more you read about this, it feels like it's just like a 21st century update on the same kind of model. Where you have these extravagantly wealthy individuals that build this kind of infrastructure that, by all accounts, like by a million different ways you want to look at it, should probably be some kind of public utility. And yet, just somehow bumbling Congress just like doesn't have their eye on the ball.
Well, it's the same system where like everyone kind of knows that it's like egregious and totally wrong and like not conscionable, but it just like keeps marching on, and like we still get the same thing, like the sort of same half measures where we get like these fake figures like the Teddy Roosevelt of the time, or even on both sides, both sides of the meaningless political distinction, where we have like AOC talking about how we're gonna raise the taxes, or have like the Green New Deal, or Trump talking about how he's gonna bring the jobs back, something like that, where like talk. Yeah, but really, like, everything just keeps marching on in this exact direction, and, like, Bill Gates gets all the farms so that he can talk about what a great humanitarian he is while continuing all of the practices that he represents as being abusive. And,
And actually, there's a great example of that, I think on page 173, where, again, Myers brings up kind of his take on reformists in general, of which he has a pretty low opinion of. He's talking about a particular scandal involving boss Tweed and Vanderbilt, because they were heavily involved with one another. In 1872, Vanderbilt went to the legislature, that legislature whose members he had so often bought like so many cattle. This particular legislature, however, was elected in 1871 following the revelations of the Tweed ring frauds. It was regarded as a, quote, model reform body. As has already been remarked in this work, the pseudo-reform officials, or bodies elected by the American people in the vain hope of overthrowing corruption, will often go to greater lengths in the disposition of the people's rights and interests than the most hardened politicians, because they are not suspected of being corrupt, and their measures have the appearance of being enacted for the public good. Sound familiar? The Tweed clique had been broken up, but the capitalist who had assiduously bribed its members and profited so hugely from its political acts were untouched and in greater power than ever before. The source of all this corruption had not been struck at in the slightest. Tweed, the politician, was sacrificed and went to prison and died there. The capitalists who had corrupted representative bodies everywhere in the United States before and during his time were safe and respected and in a position to continue their work of corruption. Tweed made the classic unforgivable blunder of going into politics as a business instead of into commercialism. The very capitalists who had profited so greatly by his corruption were the first to express horror at his acts. From the reform, he puts in quotes, legislature of 1872, Vanderbilt secured all that he sought. The act was so dexterously worded that while not nominally giving a perpetual franchise, it practically revoked the qualified parts of the Charter of 1832. It also compassionately relieved him of the necessity of having to pay out about $4 million in replacing the dangerous roadway by imposing that cost upon New York City. Once these improvements were made, Vanderbilt bonded them as though they had been made with private money. So cool. I guess there were also, the reform legislature also, I think they gave him a 999-year lease of the 4th Avenue rail car line in New York City, and he didn't have to pay any taxes, and he was allowed to extend the line on the public dime, and and do all kinds of chicanery. And these reformists basically allowed him to do it. Yeah, that's true. The Vanderbilt's in 1894, so that must have been his son or his grandson, leased that 4th Avenue line for 999 years to the Metropolitan Street Railway Company, controlled by those eminent financiers, William C. Whitney and others, whose monumental briberies, thefts, and piracies have frequently been uncovered in official investigations. For almost 1,000 years, unless a radical change of conditions comes, the Vanderbilts will draw a princely revenue from the ownership of this franchise alone. So I wonder what happened to the 4th Avenue if that got merged into the subway system. But nonetheless, like to have a 999-year title of ownership to like a subway line in the big, just like fuck off.
Yeah. You know what? Something that we didn't actually get to go into like so much when we previously recorded this episode, but is an interesting kind of angle on what you brought up in terms of like the discourse of conspiracy versus like sort of the faceless maw or the grand social forces or things like that, is the fact that during this time, and to an extent even now, I think that maybe we did kind of allude to this previously, and you mentioned January 6th as being an example. Conspiracy is always discarded so flippantly when it's about people of great power, great wealth. But it's an accusation that's also like very readily deployed against workers, against other groups.
Yes.
Absolutely.
He gets a little bit in here about the Haymarket riots, which Myers, to his credit, definitely calls out as like a probable false flag, and just talks about the Pinkertons. We've done a lot of research and stuff we were writing a few years ago about the extent of Pinkerton fuckery in basically disrupting any kind of labor union or workers organization that existed, and constantly inveighing in the press about how these people represented one or another sadistic, sinister conspiracy that stretched across the entire country. And then later on, that kind of morphed into like the Red Scare anti-communism of like everybody's a sicko Bolshevik who wants to overthrow our great government that serves us so well. Like conspiracism, I think that Carl Oglesby was definitely right about that. That's like standard operating procedure for the
That's a great
classes.
Passage of that book, but I think this is a really telling part about the Haymarket tragedy. Sorry to rudely interrupt you, but I think you'll appreciate this paragraph. He talks about the Haymarket incident. The hurling of the bomb, whether done by a secret emissary or by a sympathizer with labor, proved the lever which the propertied class have been feverishly awaiting. Great how that always works out. They always get, just the
we always
that,
slip up, and give them exactly what they want.
Yeah. Spies, Fielding, and their comrades, not like spies like espionage agents, but this name of, one of the sort of organizers. Fielding and their comrades were at once cast into jail. The newspapers invented wild yarns of conspiracies and midnight plots, and raucously demanded the hanging of the leaders. The trifling formality of waiting until their guilt had been proved was not considered. The most significant event, however, was the secret meeting of about 300 leading American capitalists to plan the suppression of quote-unquote anarchy. So, while everyone was, up in arms about, the conspiracies and the secret midnight plots between, these anarchists, there was a secret meeting among all these capitalists about what to do about the quote-unquote anarchists.
Sounds like the original Committee of 300 that I think was big during the Cold War, which served a kind of similar purpose at the end of the day. But yeah, funny how they all. I wonder if they were in a room that was filled with smoke.
Maybe. Very horrified they professed themselves to be at violent outrages and destruction of property and of life. Their views were given wide circulation and commendation. They were the finest types of commercial success and prestige. They were the owners of railroads that slaughtered thousands of human beings every year because of the demands of profit, of factories which sucked the very life out of their toilers, and which filled the hospitals, slums, brothels, and graveyards with an ever-increasing assemblage. Every man in that conclave, as a beneficiary of the existing system, had drained his fortune from the sweat, sorrow, miseries, and death agonies of a multitude of workers. These are the men who came forth to form the Citizens Association, and within a few hours subscribed $100,000 as a fighting fund. So then there was a kangaroo court where, they tried everyone with a jury that was obviously packed. And yeah, this is actually the relevant part where in a slightly subsequent section called Capitalist Triumph by Fraud, This is actually where, relevant to our discussion of reformers, we have Theodore Roosevelt mentioned. Theobald. In the New York City election of 1886, 3 parties contested: the Labor Party, Tammany Hall, and the Republican Party. Steeped in decades of the most loathsome corruption, Tammany Hall was chosen as the medium by which the Labor Party was to be defrauded and effaced. Pretending to be the champion of the people's rights and boasting that it stood for democracy against aristocracy, Tammany Hall had long deceived the mass of people to plunder them. It was a powerful, splendidly organized body of mercenaries and self-seekers which, by trading on the principles of democracy, have been able to count on the partisan votes of a predominating element of the wage-working class. In reality, however, it was absolutely directed by a leader or quote-unquote boss who, with his confederates, made a regular traffic of selling legislation to the capitalists, on the one hand, and who, on the other, enriched themselves by a colossal system of blackmail. They sold immunity to pickpockets, confidence men, and burglars, compelled the saloon keepers to pay for protection, and even extorted from the wretched women of the street and brothels. This was the organization that the ruling class, with its fine assumptions of respectability, now depended upon to do its work of breaking up the political labor revolt. The candidate of Tammany Hall was the ultra-respectable Abram S. Hewitt, a millionaire capitalist. The Republican Party nominated a verbose, pushful, self-glorifying young man who, by a combination of fortuitous circumstances, later attained the position of President of the United States. This was Theodore Roosevelt, the scion of a moderately rich New York family and a remarkable character whose pugnacious disposition, indifference to political conventionalities, capacity for exhortation, and bold political shrewdness were mistaken for greatness of personality. The phenomenal success to which he subsequently rose is characteristic of the prevailing turgidity and confusion of the popular mind. Both Hewitt and Roosevelt were, of course, acceptable to the capitalist class. As, however, New York was normally a city of democratic politics, and as Hewitt stood the greater chance of winning, the support of those opposed to the labor movement was concentrated upon him.
Yes, and the third candidate, I believe, in that race was Henry George, who, was an interesting, eclectic, sort of a socialist of the late 1800s who was really big on, like, land tax. That was his big thing.
Georgism,
Georgism
itself was named for Henry George.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do an episode on Henry George one day, because actually Myers says that he was the odds-on favorite to win the race and become mayor of New York, and then Tammany Hall literally stuffed the ballot boxes. They stole it. It was a fake election, folks. And they basically, I forget if did Teddy Roosevelt end up winning that, or did the Tammany Hall candidate? Either way, Henry George did not win, but it was basically an outright electoral fraud. And they, I think they were able to split the vote enough and then stuff the ballot boxes that they defrauded Henry George and, prevented the Labor Party from taking power there, which is pretty cool. And and I guess, according to Myers, Roosevelt's reformist bona fides were kind of laughable at the end of the day. Like, when he actually did make any kind of attempt to, like, stand up to the trusts, they kind of smacked him down and reformed in different ways that he couldn't get at. So to the extent that he even cared, he was not super successful, because I think by the time his presidency was over, like, Standard Oil had been broken up, but then it just, like, reconstituted into, like, 5 mega companies that eventually, like we've said a million times, like T1000, like, congealed together. More powerful than ever. Oh, yeah, and when you were talking about the 300 capitalists in Chicago, were you referring to the Citizens Association?
Yes, that's what they
and so
formed,
they would go on, I think we mentioned on You Can't Win, the Secret Six and the, what was it, like the Citizens Society for the Prevention of Crime in Chicago. That's literally where we got the term silk topper from, when a certain podcaster's grandfather was assaulted like that by his parents outside of an opera house by some very based revolutionary comrades who declared, we don't like silk toppers, and then ripped their silk tops off, and then the father of that individual, this is like in the paper, summoned the Secret Six, which were like literally 6 secret industrialists in Chicago that had like a vigilante network to stop quote unquote crime, but actually like their entire resources were marshaled to hunt down these anti-silk topper sickos that had the audacity to ruffle up somebody's silk top.
Yes.
So it's like this is the origin of that, at least in Chicago, which is very interesting. We'll come back and, and also I think we'll get a little I think towards the end of this book, there's even some like, Jerome, Arizona, and connections to what we talked about, like the Jerome deportation and the Bisbee deportation during World War I, which is the same Chicago group of people, same familial people as well from different sides of the family.
That a certain name happened to come up again in this book.
We'll get there. We'll get there when we go to.
There actually was anything to that in this case.
That connection is somewhat tenuous. We'll get to it, but it is interesting. But the familial connection through like the Citizens Association down to like the APL down to deporting the IWW in World War I, that is a direct familial connection, which I'll elaborate on later. We don't need to get too far on it, but so just to say real quickly, like, after Vanderbilt finally died, he left his fortune to his I think his main son, was it William Vanderbilt? And then, basically started this, William H. Vanderbilt, who invested heavily in the Reading Railroad to take control of Pennsylvania's anthracite mines, which he mostly did. He betrayed a bunch of other...
famous incident with the Molly Maguires where, as you mentioned, Pinkertons, at the behest of, the capitalists, like, basically framed a bunch of people. And ended up. We will do an episode on that one day, where 19 Irish, some probably legit radicals, others falsely accused, were hanged in one of the most. Really, if you want a glimpse into like the jurisprudence and like legal system of like the late 1800s, it's really a great case study, because it's what if the railroad tycoon who wants these people dead became the prosecutor? It's like, what the fuck? And like his friend who like ran for governor and lost and blames it on the labor movement is the judge. What if the jury was all Germans who didn't speak English? And what if like the entire thing was instigated by like an undercover Pinkerton agent? Who was like the leader of the conspiracy.
Wonderful. I love our system. Thank God that we don't live in a Stalinist hellhole where we have real
and
legal
thank
rights.
God there's never ever been a conspiracy, and the broad social forces arrange these entertaining dramas that no one has any intentionality in whatsoever.
Yes. Another thing just briefly worth mentioning is one of the things that William H. Vanderbilt got into, now that he was such a tycoon, he suddenly developed an interest in art. And so he was one of the real trailblazers of a billionaire just like showering like truckloads of money onto the art world and then getting a bunch of cred for being basically a person of high class and good taste and sophistication. But apparently like he literally would like send his art agents to Paris and stuff, and he would pay by like the foot for art. Like he thought that the bigger canvases were just worth more, and really had like no,
it's so fun, because I've seen, like, I remember, it's stuck in my mind, this is kind of not a direct analogy. There's a difference between these two phenomena, of course, but I remember watching, like, this one episode of some show like MTV Cribs, or it was some kind of show like that, and, the person just had this, like, vast, huge, like, penthouse apartment that was mostly empty and like, very sparsely furnished, but he had all these paintings that were just stacked all along the floor, like leaning against the sides of the walls, just like rows and rows of paintings. It's
my God.
Yeah.
It's sick.
Yeah.
These. So yeah.
Like
again,
they were leaning against
new.
the floor, like a discarded.
That feels very much like a thing Andrew Getty would do.
Yeah, exactly.
Just, throw his Picasso on the floor, like face down.
Yeah, there's like a $5 million like Archaeopteryx like skeleton like jangled in the corner.
So the final thing I'll say is, like, once you started getting into the grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt, they started intermarrying, which is, again, like, that's a pattern we notice with these families, whether it's to preserve their fortunes so that it doesn't get split up too much. That's why oftentimes, like, there's kind of an interesting tendency of like third and fourth cousins from this kind of New England-y world to keep on marrying each other so as not to dilute like the original fortune. And of course they're all investing it in the market as they go. So like these fortunes are just, the capital is making money for them the whole time. So, they got up to $700 million by the time of Gustavus Myers writing it. And I wonder how much 700 million is today. I just want to look up that real quick, because I looked up the other day that John D. Rockefeller had the equivalent of $400 billion in his time.
Like, I mean, again, I think we talked about this, like, on one of our Q&A episodes. We were asked about, like, these sort of Forbes lists of, like, the richest people and, who really, like, how do those, like, reckonings really deal with wealth? Like, how do they consider people's assets? Like, how do they talk about wealth, like, across generations, things like that, It seems like there's different ways that one could appraise someone's wealth.
Absolutely. I think because somebody asked me the other day, and I Googled, like, Rockefeller family net worth, and of course there's, like, it's very hard to, like, pin down any kind of precise number, but most of, like, the websites I saw were, like, putting it between $9 and $12 billion for the entire family. And I think there's over 150 heirs to John D. Rockefeller that are around, today. So the idea that, like, 150 people are splitting this, like, $11 billion pot when their, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather controlled $400 billion in his day, like, where the fuck did all that money go? You know what I mean? Like, they're still invested. They're still wealthy. Like, they did, like, David Rockefeller was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank for, like, decades. Like, I call total bullshit on that you guys only have $12 billion, like, between all of you. So, like, that's, I think, because, okay, if the Rockefeller family, just hypothetically, or the Vanderbilt family had to say, we actually own, like, $4 trillion for our entire family, that probably would, even in our extremely, like, capital-pilled society, probably provoke some kind of outrage, and people would say that's egregious.
I mean, I wonder, because it's still outrageous anyway, the amount of money that they publicly have.
It is. But here's the thing, like, they're put up as inferior to the pinnacle of the public capitalists that exist today, which is, like, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who we're supposed to believe that that's the very tippy top of the amount of money you could basically hoard, is, like, $300 billion if you're, like, a big tech guru kind of person. But to say that, oh, well, these guys have done well, but actually there's, like, a couple dozen families that have, like, over $1 trillion, like, collectively, then it kind of undercuts, like, their, public role that I think is helpful for
something
the ruling
that I think
class.
I'm thinking of, a movie that I think you've seen and that I just saw yesterday, so it's on my mind, not to divert things into popular culture, but I do think that's an interesting example or, point of instruction or reference, which is the movie Pig.
I did see it
What
recently.
comes to mind vis-a-vis that movie is that, in that movie, it seems as if the character portrayed by Nicolas Cage, he has nothing really in terms of, like, material wealth necessarily. He's very unmaterialistic in that way, but when the plot sort of requires him to manifest his social capital, he's able to do so, like, very easily because he has a name that he can trade on. And he's really able to move with incredible freedom through, like, the upper echelons of society, despite being in a way, like, unwelcome to the plot of the movie. And of course, this is a fictional scenario, but I think that is in a way indicative of, like, the way that capital can function. Like Gustavus Myers talks about how this money is in a way an abstraction of, like, the power of control over life. The control over human life, of our relationship with nature, even. And I think that if you think about capital in that way, then you might end up with a different adjudication of, special, and, like, familial ties might be more relevant to that type of appreciation of how wealth and power are exercised.
I think it's dialectical. I think that's what's coming into clear. It's, like, almost more so than the Yankee and cowboy divide. It's, like, the rapacious industrialist, like, striver, and the landed high-class families that have been here since, like, 1650 are, like, they're constantly combining forces to sustain the other. Like,
and I think that, like, for instance, consider, like, the incredible investment that, like, Getty made in the Getty Museum. That is, like, an expenditure of money, like, for, like, quote unquote, like, the public use. Like, there isn't necessarily a return on that investment in the sense of money. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But to say that there isn't a return on that investment in some way, I feel like would be naive.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly.
I mean, this is a guy who like wouldn't pay kidnappers like a ransom for his grandson.
Exactly. Yeah, but
the biggest miser you ever knew, and Vanderbilt
but
too was like an extreme miser.
But he just wanted people to have access to the unicorn pictures so badly that he was willing to, he wouldn't let there be actual non-pay phones. He put pay phones in his house to force his maids and servants to use the pay phone. That's how miserly he was.
He didn't want to be interrupted of like humiliating JP Getty Jr. in front of his grandson and like ask like his grandson questions that his dad got wrong when he was a kid and then go hogue.
Yeah.
Like what a fucking psycho. But hogue. What a maniac.
Hogue. Yes. But who was it? It was some figure in this book. I think maybe who we talked about in the previous volume, who was like praised for the way that like he gave his wealth away to orphans because he didn't have like a family to pass things on to.
That was one of the early Boston merchants. He was like one of the first to do it, and everyone was
being
like,
so after being so like you said like rapacious and so greedy and miserly throughout his entire life. Then he gave like this endowment at the end of his life. Yeah. And like, does that really, it's like.
Well, just like how Henry Ford hated philanthropy almost as much as he hated Jews and, distrusted it and thought like, basically if you give a mouse a cookie, it's going to want like healthcare and other things like that. So like, fuck workers. I don't want to give them shit. But then at the end they were because it was the New Deal era, his children were facing this like huge estate tax burden. And so that's when like they spun off the Ford Foundation, which then became a vehicle for like CIA ruling class like conspiracies to like basically do all kinds of like culture manipulation and like seed people into countries where like help launch coups and all kinds of fun shit like that. So their money stays moving and the Vanderbilts married into the Whitney family, and of course they have the Whitney Museum, right? And they're connected, I think, with maybe it was in the first episode where we broke down like the Roosevelt, Whitney, like Van Cortlandt, like there were like 7 names attached to it.
Where I grew up, like everything is named after the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts. Mm-hmm. Everything is named after the 2 of them.
They're so great. And also, Gustavus Myers notes kind of comically that at one point in 1892, when the workers, I think, in Buffalo, working for one of Vanderbilt's railroads, went on strike for shorter hours and more pay, Vanderbilt had the governor of New York send out the entire state militia, 8,000 people, with machine guns and bayonets to basically stop the strikers from picketing. But if, however, the Vanderbilts could not afford to pay their workers a few cents more in wages a day, they could afford to pay millions of dollars for matrimonial alliances with foreign titles. These excursions into the realm of high-caste European nobility have thus far cost the Vanderbilt family about $15 or $20 million, when impecunious counts, lords, dukes, and princes, having wasted the inheritance originally obtained by robbery and perpetuated by robbery, are in the anxious lookout for marriages with great fortunes, and the American money magnates, satiated with vulgar wealth, aspire to titled connections, the arrangement becomes easy. Romance can be dispensed with, and the lawyers depended upon to settle the preliminaries. So yeah, I guess Consuelo, the daughter of William K. Vanderbilt, married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. There were a couple marriages like this, where they basically married, just like the Astor family, they literally married into European royalty, which is kind of the ultimate example of basically people that have title and social capital accumulated over centuries, but don't always, because many of them were impecunious, were a little bit short on cash. So I think, that's the other thing about these like New England families is like, we're not necessarily saying every single one of these families was ultra wealthy from the very beginning, but being at the top of society, having that reserve of social capital meant that as long as you married a really successful business person, like every generation or two, you basically could kind of stay up at the top. I think I retweeted something recently that was basically saying that like the top families in Florence mostly haven't changed since the 15th century, like in terms of family wealth. Like the top 25% of families in Florence are like still there. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like how many things have changed in the last 700 years, but like when you have those privileges and they don't get overthrown by something like, say, like a social revolution, then, they stay there and they fester and basically clog up the entire, like they maintain the meta monopoly over the entire political legal process, which which draws these like Daniel Plainview-ass motherfuckers like moths to a flame. And then that's because you need both those things. The other thing I remember reading recently was it took 3 or 4 generations for the Rockefellers to be actually invited to join the Knickerbocker Club in New York. Now that was one of like the oldest, waspiest kind of gentlemen's like societies in Manhattan. And even though Rockefeller, I think, comes from like a pretty old lineage in America, he was the son of a con man out in Ohio, and he didn't have quite that pedigree that, a real silk topper from like Connecticut had. So it took until like his grandchildren, after they had amassed the biggest fortune, at least that's what we're told, in the history of the United States. It took them 3 generations to be admitted into the Knickerbocker Club. So that tells you something, that this social capital is guarded very jealously because it's very powerful. Right? But it also, it has to be married literally in a way with capital to have its full effect. And capital without social, then you're just like Trump. You're like a guy who has $1 billion, but like nobody fucks with you. So like, how much can you really do? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can basically be the Theodore Roosevelt equivalent of the modern day, and be like or even the Hewitt equivalent, the Abraham Hewitt equivalent, where you're like talking about how you're going to help the common man or something. Mm-hmm.
But then you just get,
no.
I mean, somebody did take a shot. Somebody did shoot Roosevelt in like 1912 when he ran as a third party. So
right. Yeah. And he continued speaking through it. Right.
Mm-hmm. He did.
I have a bullet in my belly. I remember it very clearly, yes.
We were all there.
Yeah, why was he shot?
Good question. I'd like to go into that and see. I feel like somebody lied and it wasn't just a psychotic lone gunman, because how many of them really are?
And William McKinley actually was assassinated before him.
By great Polish-American Leon Czolgosz.
In fact, I think that Roosevelt was like scared because he was such a, an outdoorsman. He was scaling what would eventually become Mount McKinley in Alaska at the time. And the Secret Service like clambered up to like the top of Mount McKinley to like find him and tell him that he had become president. I feel like that's like something from some like really... laudatory, panegyric Roosevelt biography, but it was definitely represented as true by somebody.
That sounds TR as fuck.
It's very, very much very much in line with the sort of legend of TR. But McKinley is interesting because he like seemed to survive, but then died.
He died. Kind of like Garfield. Garfield, another one who got shot under strange circumstances. Kind of a populist, but also a Freemason. And also mentioned in this book as dealing in corruption in an egregious way, just like everybody else.
This is interesting. I didn't actually realize this at all. Roosevelt was shot at point-blank range by a delusional saloon keeper named John Flaming Schrank, who believed that the ghost of assassinated President William McKinley had directed him to kill Roosevelt.
What? Okay, putting that on the list.
Don't forget that he had that story about Bigfoot, too.
I didn't.
I don't think he actually experienced
National
it himself,
Parks?
but he told it secondhand. Yeah,
was he trying
parks?
to protect Bigfoot?
Well, exactly.
There
are all those mysterious disappearances. What is going on with Roosevelt? Don't forget the Rough Riders and all that stuff.
Trying to fuck with Cuba back then.
The Spanish-American War.
Yeah, he was a real dark cowboy.
He was very much a dark cowboy. Yeah, exactly. He was like the first lame cowboy LARPer.
He was born to kill.
Yeah, born to kill.
He really did. He went to Rojava for no reason.
He literally did go to Rojava for no reason. Exactly. Exactly.
Cool.
Oh no. What if somebody were to become president?
Oh God, no.
Look. All I heard was screams and bottle clanks. Police sirens going up and down the streets. Spent years hoping we would hit the lottery. Had to get emotion, hoping wasn't getting us a thing. Now I'm out to be the next monopoly. Anything I'm doing, it's your thing, gotta see. Nosy ass people need to stay up off of me. $1 billion dreams, gotta come with $1 billion schemes. Ever since I had a tab with Muhammad, I was whipping up a plan with the squadron. Number one on the man, if you watching, I was taught that if you got it, then you got it. Fuck the talking. I'll be the shit till they lower it at my coffin. Never burn a bridge if I still gotta cross it. I'm probably drinking on the job, but I'm bossing. Late nights, early mornings, workaholic. Whatchamacallit? Been had bars since back in the days. If you folks don't recall it, they hit me with the gossip. I tell them beg your pardon. I'm aiming at prey, so don't become a target. But let me switch the topic. See, lately I've been upset. Coming from a city they say everyone gave up in. When they filled up the roster, we were what's left. Bet them same hoes try to holler, cause we up next. Fuck that. Bitch, I'm from the 90s, I need all that. Looking for a job, better call back. If anybody wondering where the boss at, tell them I'll be gone for a minute, cause I'm on track. Bitch, I'm from the 90s, I need all that. Looking for a job, better call back. If anybody wondering where the boss at, tell them I'll be gone for a minute, cause I'm on track.
Welcome players and playettes. Thank you for choosing Damn Track as your mode of transportation. Our scheduled time for departure is 11:47, which means we're not a minute early and not a second late. If everyone could pull out your golden tickets, we'll be coming around to collect. We have complimentary cognac in the back and beautiful women for your laughs.
Come see what we got in store. Tell me what you waiting for. They're about to close the doors, but before you get on board, just know.
On track, I spark instantly. Darth's killer beat, my heart is my artillery. Darth melody, art embassy, auxiliary. I'm spaced out, you can't see me, I'm dark energy. Who came from that get right era, a midnight terror, but still keep it lit like Tesla in the AC. Coolin' with the motivated Navy. Always hold my shit down, cause I'm an anchor, baby. Running shit in this town, we do that on the daily. Tell them fuck a freestyle, somebody better pay me. But I'll play my part till I shut down, cause we came too far to close shop and give up now, that's real.
If I could get everyone's attention for a hot second, we're gonna make a quick pit stop in Nowhere, Nevada. Next stop is Swahili. We got a lot of young legends in the place to be. Just a heads up, if your lady comes up missing, you probably won't find her in the lost and found. Now, sit tight and enjoy the rest of your trip.
Bitch, I'm from the 90s, I need all that. Looking for a job, better call back. If anybody wondering where the boss at, tell them I'll be gone for a minute, cause I'm on track. Bitch, I'm from the 90s, I need all that. Looking for a job, better call back. If anybody wondering where the boss at, tell them I'll be gone for a minute, cause I'm on track. On track. On track. On track. On track. On track. Come see what we got in store. Tell me what you waiting for. They're about to close the doors, but before you get on board, just know